Good morning. My name is Deja Thomas, and I am a survey analyst with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings of our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and the environment. The survey was supported with funding from the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and the Windy Hill Fund. And today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC corporate and donor circles. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, survey analyst Lauren Mora, will walk you through some of the key findings from the environment survey, and then we will discuss some main takeaways before answering questions from the audience. Before I introduce my colleague, I have a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a question about the survey, please send an email to the address on the screen, that is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and the organization along with your question. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take nor support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Lauren.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Deja for that kind introduction. If you give me a moment while I share my screen. Great. And thank you all again for joining us. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge my co-authors on this survey. They include Survey Director Mark Baldessare, Associate Survey Director Dean Bonner, and of course, my fellow survey analyst, Deja Thomas. And I'd also like to take another moment to acknowledge and greatly thank our funders, the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and the Windy Hill Fund. So the PPIC statewide survey is in its 26th year, and this 2024 environment survey is the 24th annual survey on environmental issues. The survey was conducted from June 24th to July 2nd using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel online. And the sample size is 1,648 adults with a margin of error of 3.2%. And our sample size of likely voters is 1,261 with a margin of error of 3.7%. So getting into some key findings. Given 2024 is an important election year with the presidential, US Senate, and House of Representative races in November, we asked how important candidates' positions on environmental issues were in Californians determining their votes. And we found that close to 8 in 10 Californian likely voters say that their candidate's position on environmental issues are very or somewhat important in determining their votes for president, US Senator, and House races. Majorities across demographic groups and regions of the state hold this view, and majorities across parties also share this view, although Democrats and independents are far more likely to say that candidates' environmental positions are important than Republicans. And this includes about 9 in 10 Democrats, 8 in 10 independents, and less than 6 in 10 Republicans. Getting into the presidential race, a majority of 55% of Californian likely voters say they would choose Joe Biden in November's presidential race, a much larger share than the 30% that would choose Donald Trump. Partisans continue to support their party's candidate. 84% of Democrats support Biden, 82% of Republicans favor Trump, and independent voters lean towards the Democratic side with 45% Biden and 26% Trump. Notably, 11% of likely voters say they would vote for someone else for president, and this includes 6% of Democrats, 5% of Republicans, and 21% of independents. And I just want to note, among California likely voters who say the candidates' positions for the environment are very important to them, 73% would vote for Biden compared to 18% for Trump and 6% for someone else. Among those who say the environment is not too important in determining their vote, 57% would vote for Trump, 24% for Biden, and 10% for somebody else. Next, we asked about voting on a $10 billion climate bond in November to pay for flood protection and climate resiliency projects. I just want to note that the proposition for ballot title and labor were not available in time for the filling of this survey, but we were able to ask this question. And we found that 59% of Californian likely voters would vote yes on this $10 billion state bond. And voters' support does vary across parties. 78% of Democrats would vote yes, 25% of Republicans, and 55% of independents. And about half or more say they would vote yes across demographic groups and regions of the state. Next, turning to climate change. Climate change seems to be on the mind of many Californians. When asked the most important environmental issue facing the state, climate change was the top answer at 17% of the responses, followed by wildfires at 17% of the responses for climate change, 15% for wildfires, and 14% for water supply. And more about climate change, about 7 in 10 Californians say they worry a great deal or fair amount about climate change. And for some Californians, worries about climate change may be related to concern about their homes. For the first time, we were able to ask Californians if they were concerned that home insurance would become more expensive due to climate change risks. And we found that about 8 in 10 say they're at least somewhat concerned that insurance would become more expensive due to climate change risks. And this includes about 47% of adults and 54% of likely voters who say they are very concerned. Overwhelming majorities across parties, regions, and demographic groups of the state are at least somewhat concerned, but there is differences in the degree of concern. Across regions, more than 4 in 10 say they are very concerned, with residents in the Inland Empire being the most likely to be very concerned. And also notably, homeowners are much more likely than renters to be very concerned. 56% of homeowners say they are very concerned about the increase in home insurance prices. We asked Californians about climate policies and what they thought climate policies should focus on, either climate mitigation, meaning reducing greenhouse gases, or climate adaptation, meaning adapting to a harsher climate. And 6 in 10 adults and likely voters say it is more important for these policies to address climate mitigation. Less than 4 in 10 say it's more important for these policies to address climate adaptation, specifically 35% of adults and 38% of likely voters. Very few, about 1%, volunteer that mitigation and adaptation are equally important or that neither is important. 3/4 of Democrats and 6 in 10 independents say that it is more important for policies to address reducing greenhouse gases. And a solid majority of Republicans think climate adaptation is more important for policies to address. Majorities across regions and demographic groups think policies should focus on climate mitigation. We asked Californians if they thought stricter environmental regulations and laws were worth the cost or if they cost too many jobs and hurt the economy. 58% of adults and likely voters say stricter environmental laws and regulations are worth the cost. About 4 in 10 say stricter environmental laws and regulations cost too many jobs and hurt the economy. And this includes 40% of adults and 41% of likely voters. And partisans are divided on this issue as well. And majorities across demographic groups and regions say stricter environmental regulations are worth the cost. 2/3 of those in San Francisco say stricter environmental regulations are worth the cost compared to smaller majorities in other regions of the state. Central Valley residents are the least likely to say these regulations and laws are worth the cost. Relatedly, 2 in 3 Californians say environmental protection should be given priority, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, while about 3 in 10 say economic growth should be given priority, even if the environment suffers to some extent. We also asked views about renewable energy. And 2 in 3 adults and likely voters favor the state law that requires 100% of the state's electricity to come from renewable resources by the year 2045. However, when asked if they would be willing to pay more for electricity generated by renewable sources, such as solar or wind, majorities of adults and likely voters say they would not be willing to pay more. About 6 in 10 Democrats say they are willing, 8 in 10 Republicans, and 6 in 10 independents are not willing to pay more. Majorities across demographic and regional groups are unwilling, and the share who say they are willing reaches half only among Asian Americans, college graduates, and San Francisco Bay Area residents. Moving on to oceans and coastal issues. More than 9 in 10 adults and likely voters say the conditions of oceans and beaches are at least somewhat important to the economy and quality of life for California's future. This includes about 6 in 10 or more who say it isn't very important. Very few say it is not too or not at all important. And today, majorities across partisan, demographic, and regional groups say ocean and beach conditions are very important. Residents in the coastal regions of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Orange, San Diego are about as likely as residents in inland regions of the Inland Empire and Central Valley to feel this way. We asked Californians about a number of coastal issues and how big a problem they thought they were in the coastal area closest to them in California. And over 9 in 10 adults say that plastics and marine debris are at least somewhat of a problem in the part of California that's closest to them, including 6 in 10 who say it is a big problem. Notably, residents in Los Angeles are the most likely to say this at 66%. Over 8 in 10 adults say declining marine life is at least somewhat of a problem, including 46% who say it is a big problem. And residents in Orange, San Diego are the least likely to say this. 9 in 10 adults say ocean and beach pollution along the California coast is at least somewhat of a problem, including about 4 in 10 who say it is a big problem. And about half of residents in Los Angeles say this is a problem is shared higher than all other regions. And when it comes to overfishing or depleting the fishing stock, about 8 in 10 adults say this is at least somewhat of a problem, including roughly a third who say it is a big problem. Moving on, we asked Californians multiple questions involving extreme weather and disaster preparedness. And many Californians believe extreme weather events are connected to climate change. Overwhelming majorities are concerned that climate change will cause heat waves, droughts, and wildfires that are more severe. And about a quarter of adults and a fifth of likely voters say they have considered moving to a different home to avoid the impacts of global warming, including sea level rise, flooding, heat waves, and wildfires. Residents in the Central Valley at 28% are the most likely to say they have considered moving to a different home, while those in Orange, San Diego at 16% are the least likely. Among demographic groups, residents making less than $40,000, adults ages 18 to 34, and Latinos are the most likely to say they have considered moving because of climate change. And notably, renters are more likely than homeowners to say this. About 3 in 10 renters say this compared to 17% of homeowners. When asked if they are personally prepared for a disaster themselves, only 35% of adults say that they are prepared for a disaster, while 65% say they are not prepared. And this 65% includes 23% who intend to prepare in the next 6 months, 22% who intend to prepare in the next year, and 20% who do not intend to prepare at all. We got this question from FEMA's 2023 National Household Survey, which found that 51% of Americans said they were prepared for a disaster. So overall, Californians are less likely to report than Americans overall being prepared for a disaster. Across regions, about 4 in 10 residents in Orange, San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area say they are prepared, while smaller shares in Los Angeles, Central Valley, and the Inland Empire say the same. Men are slightly more likely than women to report being prepared for a disaster. Whites are more likely than African, Asian Americans, and Latinos to say that they are prepared as well. And moving on to approvals. About half of Californians approve of Governor Newsom's handling of environmental issues, and approvers fall higher among Democrats at 78% than 44% of independents and 15% of Republicans. Views on the legislature's handling of environmental issues follow a similar pattern. 72% of Democrats approve, 44% of independents, and 13% of Republicans. Californians are also divided on President Biden's handling of environmental issues. 49% approve and 48% disapprove. Again, there is a wide partisan divide. 74% of Democrats approve, 74% of Democrats, 46% of independents, and 18% of Republicans. And just 1 in 4 Californians approve of the US Congress's handling of environmental issues, and about 3 in 4 disapprove. This concludes my presentation of key findings for today, but there are many other topics on this survey that we were not able to cover today. And I highly recommend um, everybody take a look at our crosstabs for all adults and crosstabs of likely voters, along with the survey report. Other topics include water supply and pollution, wildfires, electric vehicles, the US participating in international climate efforts, and trust in the government when it comes to handling environmental issues. I'd also encourage the audience to be on the lookout for any future blogs using this environment surveys data. Before I bring back my colleague Deja Thomas to discuss key takeaways from this survey, I want to remind everyone that we'll be taking audience questions in just a few minutes. If you have a question for us, please email them to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And be sure to include your name and organization. And this concludes my presentation, and I'll bring back Deja.
Hello. Thank you, Lauren, for the excellent presentation and summary of findings from this year's Californians and the Environment Survey. I thought I'd start the key takeaways by talking about California as a leader in climate change efforts. There were a couple questions that we asked in this year's survey, and we asked them pretty often in environment surveys overall. Most Californians approve of the state government making its own policies separate from the federal government to address climate change, a view that has remained relatively strong over time. Today's survey finds that 2 in 3 adults and likely voters are in favor of California's state government making its own policies. Majorities across the state's regions and among demographic groups are in favor, and most Democrats and independents are in favor, while about 2 in 3 Republicans oppose. The overall share is actually similar to a year ago, and over 6 in 10 adults have said this since 2014. We also find that 2 in 3 adults say it is at least somewhat important to them that California acts as a leader in climate change efforts around the world, including 1 in 3 who say it's very important. And there is some variation on this question when we look at demographic groups and regions. For example, among racial ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to say this at 4 in 10, while whites at about 3 in 10 are least likely to say this. And across regions of the state, residents in the Inland Empire are the most likely, while Central Valley residents are the least likely. Looking back at environmental surveys of the past, I noticed that most adults have said California acting as a leader in climate change efforts was at least somewhat important since we started asking this question. However, the share has declined since then, from about 8 in 10 in 2017 to 2 in 3 who say this today, which is still a large share, but a notable decline. In fact, just looking at the share of adults saying it's very important, it's actually at the lowest it's been in our survey's records too. And so far, a majority haven't said it was very important since 2019. And I also took a look at the likely voters for this question, and it's kind of a similar trend there too. Relatedly, we also asked Californians how important it is to prioritize certain communities, support wildfire-prone communities, and to reduce flood risks when it comes to the state's climate adaptation strategies. About 3 in 4 adults and likely voters say it's at least somewhat important to prioritize social equity, tribal nations, and disadvantaged communities in climate adaptation and planning strategies, with a majority of Democrats and far fewer independents and Republicans saying it's very important. 4 in 10 residents in the Inland Empire, San Francisco Bay Area, and Los Angeles say this, followed by 3 in 10 each of residents in the Central Valley and Orange, San Diego. The overall view is similar when it comes to supporting wildfire-prone communities by expanding the regional forest and fire capacity program throughout the state and increasing local regional local and regional governments' capacities to build and maintain a pipeline of forest and health fire prevention projects. Sorry, that's a long one. 9 in 10 adults and likely voters in our survey say that this is at least somewhat important, including about half who say it is very important. And for this question as well, Democrats are more likely than other partisans to say that this is very important. Majorities of residents in the Inland Empire and San Francisco Bay Area say this compared to somewhat fewer in other regions. And when it comes to reducing flood risks in the state by helping regions to prepare for new flood patterns, over 8 in 10 adults and likely voters say it's at least somewhat important, including about 4 in 10 who say it's very important. And there's a similar partisan divide here as well. And Los Angeles residents are the most likely to say this across regions, while Orange San Diego residents are the least likely. We also asked about electric vehicles this month, including some new questions that kind of allowed us to take a deeper dive on this topic. When we asked whether they have seriously considered getting an electric vehicle, a majority of adults in the state have not considered it. About 4 in 10 say they have, and 10% say they already have one. And taking a closer look at the subgroups on this question, about half of Democrats in the state say they have considered this, while most Republicans and a small majority of independents say that they have not considered buying an electric vehicle. Half or more African Americans, Latinos, and white adults have said they have not considered buying one, and Asian Americans are somewhat more likely to say that they have considered it than not. However, it's also notable that Asian Americans and whites are the most likely among racial ethnic groups to say that they already have an electric vehicle. What's interesting is that looking back to previous environmental surveys, the overall share has pretty much swapped places from a year ago. Last year, half of adults said they have considered buying an electric vehicle, while 4 in 10 said they did not. And in addition, the share that said they already have one has seen a minor increase. And this is actually the first time since we asked this question in 2013, where the share saying they have not considered buying an electric vehicle has reached a majority. And when it comes to confidence in the state's ability to build charging stations and infrastructure needed to support large numbers of electric vehicles on the roads, a majority of Californians say they're at least somewhat confident, but if we look closely at that group, it's made up of 35% who say that they are somewhat confident, 16% who are very confident, and just 6% who say they are extremely confident. And roughly 4 in 10 say they are not too or not at all confident. So it really depends on how you slice that question. But focusing on Californians who say that they are extremely or very confident, these shares are highest among Democrats, Asian Americans, Latinos, and adults earning $40,000 a year or less than $40,000 a year, adults ages 35 to 54, and Inland Empire residents. And looking at the share saying they are not too or not at all confident, it reaches at least half among whites, Republicans, adults ages 55 and older, and adults with at least some college education. And like we did last year, we also asked Californians how much they think the use of electric vehicles helps to address climate change. Today, a slim majority say it helps only a little or not at all, including 2 in 10 who say it does not help at all. In contrast, about 1 in 10 say it helps a great deal, and a third say it helps a fair amount. Over 6 in 10 Democrats today say it helps a fair amount to address climate change, compared to far fewer of independents and Republicans. And across the state's regions, the share who say that electric vehicles will help address climate change, at least a fair amount, only reaches a majority in the San Francisco Bay Area. Last year, nearly 6 in 10 said it helped at least a fair amount, including 2 in 10 who said it helped a great deal. And in short, optimism for electric vehicles' helpfulness toward addressing climate change has kind of dwindled a little bit. And a few Californians are very or extremely confident that the state can build that infrastructure that we need to support that. Was there anything you wanted to add just in case before we move on?
Yeah, of course, just related to electric vehicles, it's notable to say that 6 in 10 Californian adults and likely voters oppose Governor Newsom's executive order of banning all new gasoline-powered vehicles by 2035. This includes like a vast majority of Republicans at 86% who say they oppose, 43% of Democrats say they're opposed, and 62% of independents oppose this proposal as well. And then going back to your first key takeaway discussion, Deja, I just want to thank you for mentioning our climate adaptation sort of questions that we asked for the first time on this survey. They're really important. And thank you for highlighting the social equity and disadvantaged communities question. We see that majority say that it's very important to consider these communities when it comes to climate adaptation strategies. And I just want to share a few numbers on some environmental inequalities. About 7 in 10 Californians say that water pollution is a bigger problem in lower income areas than their own areas in California. And a majority of Californians say the same thing when it comes to air pollution. So there's definitely some social environmental injustices that Californians are viewing when it comes to disadvantaged communities.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
for sure. Looking at the time, let's go ahead and answer questions from the audience. As a reminder to everyone out there, you can still submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and the name of your organization that you are with. With that, let's see what kind of questions we have. Your survey shows the importance of environmental issues to California voters, even across party lines. Do you see any variation on the importance of environmental issues across voters in different parts of the state? Lauren, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, of course, I'll take that one. So yes, when looking at the importance of environmental issues in determining votes for different elections this year, we did find that most Californians say that it is very or somewhat important for them. And specifically for president, about 8 in 10 across most regions say that the candidate's positions on environmental issues is at least somewhat important in determining who they want to vote for. The exception is being Orange County and San Diego, where the share is at 74%, which is still quite high. And conversely, 26% of Orange San Diego residents say that the candidate's positions on environmental issues is not too important, which is 6 points or more higher than any other region. San Francisco has the highest share saying this is at least somewhat important at 82%. And just a note regarding degree of importance, Los Angeles actually has the highest share saying environmental issues are very important in determining their vote at 46%. And looking at Senate and House races, we see a similar story. Your residents in Orange and San Diego are the least likely to say candidates' positions on environmental issues are important for them. But still 7 in 10 or more across regions do say that this is at least somewhat important in determining who to vote for US Senator and the US House of Representatives. Yeah, do you have anything else to add, Deja? That's kind of what I
Um,
found in our likely voters crosstabs by region.
yeah, no, I think you covered that awesomely. So
Yeah.
all good. It looks like we have a question from Adam Stern of the Offshore Wind California. The climate bond includes many environmental, wildfire prevention, and clean energy programs. How did you decide to describe it as flood protection and climate resiliency programs? Did you ask with other terms? I realize that ultimately the Attorney General's office will determine what's in the ballot measure description. Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. I remember correctly that might have because we didn't have the climate bond, like we didn't have the exact ballot wording. We kind of just looked at what was available at the time, and that's what we decided to go with flood protection and climate resiliency programs. But actually, Lauren, you were the project manager, so maybe you have a little more insight there.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I had to go with. You have to keep in mind that I put together this questionnaire about 2 months ago, so it was well before we knew this would even be on the ballot. So we just had to take our best educational guess on what was included, and
Yep.
hopefully it worked.
Yes. Now the language is ready for us, so that's good.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
just we'll be asking these questions in later surveys this year, so you can keep an eye out for
yeah.
the more accurate wordings for this in September.
Yep. Okay. We have another question. Oops. Have your surveys over time pointed to any shifts in what Californians see as the most critical environmental issues facing our state? I can start with that one. Just give me a second. Okay, I'm ready. Yeah, I was actually hoping to discuss this question in the takeaways, but there was definitely not enough time. So I'm glad we got this question. Since 2020, Californians have kept the same three issues among the top three mentions when it comes to the most important environmental issues facing the state. So that's climate change, water supply and drought, and wildfires. And in 2020, 2 in 10 named climate change as the most important environmental issue, followed by more than 1 in 10 saying air pollution and 1 in 10 each saying wildfires or water and drought. And for the 2021, 2022, 2023 environment surveys, water and drought were top of mind for Californians. For these years, about 2 in 10 or more adults named water supply and drought as the most important issue. And this kind of makes sense if we considered environmental news of what was happening in those years. I also read a report by chance from NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I believe the report said the west region of the country faced one of the driest and warmest 3-year periods in that like 3-year time period. So it was kind of interesting that our survey was able to track that as well. But yeah, there was also, after the drought, there were storms and historic snowpacks in winter 2022, and then large water runoffs in the spring of 2023. Then during that winter that year, the state had above average snowpack again. So there's been a bit of a weather whiplash, and it's kind of reflected in our surveys and in other questions as well, aside from this main question. So today we see that water supply share drop to 14% after being 2 in 10 a year ago, though it still remains a top issue among the top three, rather. Uh, okay, did you have anything to add? Sorry,
No,
my
that was
cat
great.
is moving around.
No.
Okay, let's go with this question. Your survey highlights a couple key issues related to costs, such as concerns about higher insurance costs, or a limited willingness to pay more for electricity from renewable sources. Can you talk about whether these views vary by household income?
Yeah,
Lauren, I think.
I can take a stab
Yeah.
at this one. So of course, looking at the home insurance question, the share who say they're at least somewhat concerned about an increase in home insurance prices due to climate change risks is actually somewhat similar across income groups. However, when we look at the degree of concern, there is variation. The share saying they are very concerned actually increases as income increases. 39% of residents earning 40,000 or less, less than 40,000, say they are very concerned about this, compared to 45% among residents earning between 40,000 and 80,000. And a majority of 54% of residents earning 80,000 or more are very concerned about increased home insurance prices. And I was able to dig a little bit into this and saw that there was a correlation to homeownership. In our sample, 75% of residents earning less than 40,000 were actually renters. And in our survey, we found that renters are much less likely than homeowners to be very concerned about the increase in home insurance prices, which makes sense. And moving on to willingness to pay for more electricity, there's actually no variation at all. Across income groups, about 44% are willing to pay more, and a majority of about 56% say they are not willing to pay for more. So interestingly enough, no variation there when it comes to willingness to pay more for renewable energy.
Really interesting. Thanks for doing that deep dive. We have another question. Do you find any differences in how residents of inland areas and residents of coastal areas think about environmental issues, especially related to marine protection? Um, Actually, there aren't too many differences when it comes to a number of marine and ocean related questions when we ask this year. For example, similar majorities of inland and coastal residents say the condition of oceans and beaches are very important to the economy and qualities of life for California's future. When it comes to ocean and beach pollution along the state's coast, a similar share says that it's a big problem for both of these groups. And again, solid majorities of both groups say plastics and marine debris are a big problem. And when it comes to declining marine life, similar pluralities of inland and coastal residents say this. About overfishing, about 3 in 10 of both groups say this, and similar shares of inland and coastal residents also favor wind power and wave energy projects off the California coast. Though most in both of these subgroups say this, coastal residents are actually a little more likely than inland residents just to favor expanding boundaries of national marine sanctuaries and California marine protected areas. 3/4 of inland residents favor this compared to over 8 in 10 coastal residents. And while most inland and coastal residents oppose allowing more oil drilling, coastal residents are, again, more likely than inland residents to say this. And while majorities of both groups oppose expanding fracking for oil and natural gas, coastal residents are, once again, a little more likely than inland residents to say that they oppose. Yeah, it looks like we have another question. Was there anything that surprised you about your findings? Lauren, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. Well, I thought our brand new question on whether Californians have considered moving to different homes to avoid the impacts of climate change was a really interesting new thing that we got to ask, and we found that a quarter have said yes. Um, and we also asked respondents if they had been affected by an extreme weather event in the last 2 years, in which 35% said yes. And I actually looked at the correlation between these two questions, and I found that about 4 in 10 among those who have been affected by an extreme weather event have considered moving, compared to only 16% among those who have not been affected by an extreme weather event in the last 2 years. And I think this is something that makes complete sense, but it's also really interesting to see like concretely in the numbers in our
Yeah.
survey. Deja, is there anything you want to add that surprised you? I think we're almost at time.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I found surprising was actually something you mentioned in your presentation. The fact that most Californians are not prepared for a disaster, especially given, wildfires, heat waves, extreme weather that the state has been facing in the past few years. It was kind of surprising to me to see those concrete numbers. And questions like that kind of make me wonder what like prepared might mean to people,
That's a good point.
or whether they think it's important to prepare for something like a disaster and its widespread effects, or I guess what it means to be prepared. It really made me wonder. Um, okay. Well, I guess that's the end of our program. And first, I'd like to thank you, Lauren, for your presentation and discussion. Yeah.
Thank you to Deja.
Once again, I'd like to thank our funders, the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and the Windy Hill Fund, as well as the PPIC corporate and donor circles. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us online today. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you will receive an email with a link to a short survey, but you can also scan the QR code on your screen. We would appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to respond to let us know how we did today. Finally, a recording of today's events will be available by tomorrow afternoon on the PPIC website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.